Towards the end of World War II, even high-ranking Nazi generals were doubtful about how sensible some of Adolf Hitler's orders really were. This caused a man of total trust, once loyal and obedient to his commands, to become the first person to say no to the Nazi leader. In this new video, we will go through the life of Dietrich von Choltitz, the so-called savior of Paris. We will discover what led him to face the request of the highest German leader and what was the result of his decisions. Was he the cause of the defeat of the Third Reich on French soil? Did he challenge Hitler for ideals or for convenience? If you want to know everything about the day when a Nazi commander dared to disobey the Führer, stay with us, because it is time to relive his controversial story.
Hitler, by now a mere shell of the man he had been just a few years before, was visibly ill, vehemently paranoid, and was determined to turn Paris into dust before anyone else could have it. The dictator also had the perfect man in mind for such a grim task, and his name was Dietrich von Choltitz.
On July 20th, 1944, after the assassination of the Führer known as Operation Valkyrie, von Choltitz was appointed commander of the occupation forces in France and military governor of Paris. In this way, he replaced General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, who was pointed out as one of the main instigators of the plot against the Nazi leader. That position was a recognition of the loyalty demonstrated throughout von Choltitz's military career. Someone with impeccable conduct, whose destiny was to serve the German army under any circumstances. After all, he had been born for that. He came into the world on November 9, 1894, in a castle in Graflich-Wiesa, located in the current territory of Poland. He belonged to an aristocratic family with a long military tradition. Both his grandfather and his father had been high commanders in the Prussian army. He followed the same life and entered the Dresden Cadet School in 1907. His education continued there until he finally joined the 8th Infantry Regiment Prince Johann Georg as a Fähnrich, or officer candidate, just a few months before the outbreak of World War I. Von Choltitz and his unit fought on the Western Front and contributed to the German war effort in numerous well-known battles such as the Marne, Ypres, the Somme, and Saint-Quentin in 1914. Dietrich's combat performance earned him the Iron Cross. He was also able to rise to the rank of lieutenant and was beginning to make quite a name for himself within the forces. In 1929, he became a cavalry captain, and in 1937 he rose to major. But the German army in which he had spent his entire career was transforming into something completely different. His rise did not stop, however, and in 1938 he was awarded the rank of lieutenant colonel. Already a key part of the troops commanded by Adolf Hitler, he participated in the occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 and in that of Poland in September 1939. At the beginning of the Second World War, von Choltitz would be a crucial piece, always loyal to the orders of the Führer.
Von Choltitz came from a long lineage of Prussian military tradition. He had been bred to respect military hierarchy and value obedience overall. Along with his strategic wit, such traits brought him success, leading the German invasion force into Holland in the spring of 1940, where he commanded the bomber formations that pulverized Rotterdam before the city had a chance to surrender.
An outstanding performance in the Netherlands during the Nazi incursion allowed our protagonist to be promoted and decorated again after the fierce assault campaign. However, the great achievement of his career, the one that would earn him his highest promotion, was yet to come. Von Choltitz was part of the army that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Although the so-called Operation Barbarossa would not end in the best way for the Third Reich, that stage led by Hitler's right-hand man was as bloody as it was successful. His regiment attacked from the south towards Crimea with the intention of taking control of the naval base of Sevastopol. The blockade of the city was long and brutal. Germany needed almost 7 months and several offensives to conquer the objective, with brutal bombings that exceeded in intensity those of Rotterdam. Beyond that challenge, the goal was achieved, and for von Choltitz, it was special since he had to overcome personal obstacles. During the battle, he was wounded in the arm and suffered greatly physically, even showing symptoms of lung and heart failure. However, the sacrifice was rewarded. he was made lieutenant general and given command of the 11th Panzer Division. While all this was happening, time passed, and the high command of the German army carried out without any hesitation every order of its angry leader.
A year later, von Holtitz obediently enacted the Führer's scorched earth policy in the east, making sure that the advancing Soviets found nothing but smoldering rubble in the wake of the retreating Wehrmacht. For von Holtitz, his obedience and dedication were about to be rewarded. But in the Führer's eyes, the officer was a ruthless city burner, which was precisely what he needed for this operation.
Having recovered from his ailments and in better health, Dietrich von Choltitz returned to fight in 1943, taking part in the Battle of Kursk, the last major offensive of the German armed forces on the Eastern Front. After having completed his duties as commander of the Panzer Corps in that theater of operations, he was transferred to France in 1944. As we mentioned at the beginning, due to the plot against Hitler, a vacancy had been created in Paris, and von Choltitz had been chosen to fill it. From that place, he would witness a great impact on the regime. A successful operation by the Allies had brought about the landing in Normandy, which abruptly changed the scenario. The failures were piling up. Hitler had still not been able to recover from the frustrated attempt to invade the Soviet Union that had weakened his forces, and now he could not contain his enemies. The Nazis were desperate to regain a stable position, and von Choltitz was ordered to keep the Cotentin Peninsula under control of the Third Reich. As he had done throughout his life, he obeyed without question. However, he was unable to add another success to the list of successes that had accompanied him up to that point in his military career. This time, he was forced to retreat and failed to prevent rival troops from entering Europe through Brittany. In any case, the loyal military commander did not lose the recognition he had earned. On the contrary, he was taken into account at a crucial moment that we will tell you about shortly. But in the meantime, the panorama before his eyes was very complex, although the Führer trusted von Choltitz to keep the city under Axis control in difficult times.
Hitler's Third Reich was rapidly crumbling before his very eyes. The vast empire that had once spanned from Tripoli to Rome to Kiev was now shrinking, drawing ever so close to Berlin. Also, Paris was still under Nazi control, but not for long.
Near the end of the war, Hitler had the outrageous idea of setting Paris on fire. Despite his beliefs, the person he chose to light the first flame did not respond as he expected. This was the crucial mission that we anticipated the Führer placed on the shoulders of von Choltitz, who was to prepare to destroy all the religious and historical monuments of the city before they fell into the hands of the Allies. The Nazi leader understood that he would probably not be able to contain his enemies, but that would not prevent him from destroying the French capital until it was reduced to a pile of rubble, using the same scorched earth policy that the general had already successfully executed in Eastern Europe. Although Dietrich von Choltitz was not clear about it at the time, something changed. The military man who had built a career without any blemish, strictly respecting every order from his superiors, began to weave an unknown idea inside his head. Doubts filled him, and he began to internally question the Führer's thoughts.
German engineers had already started to prepare for the destruction of Paris, and many of the city's bridges had already been set up with explosives, while they had stored significant amounts of U-boat torpedoes in the underground tunnels that could be triggered when the order was given. The plan was well in motion to destroy the City of Lights. All that was needed now was von Choltitz's order.
Despite the questions that were growing within him, he heeded Hitler's request and took the first steps as agreed. His initial move was to set up headquarters in the magnificent Hôtel Le Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli, opposite the Tuileries and the Louvre Museum. He was determined to go ahead. However, what he found could not discourage him further. German intelligence warned him that a popular uprising was about to break out as soon as the Allied troops approached. For this reason, In mid-August, von Choltitz made a show of force with the idea of discouraging the resistance. He organized a parade of 17 Panther tanks, but it was of no use. The Nazi general, who was supposed to have 25,000 soldiers, had lost many of those forces, and almost all of his tanks had been sent to the burning beaches of Normandy and to the lands of northern France, where enemy forces were advancing on their way to Berlin. The latter was the only apparent advantage for the Third Reich. The Allies did not intend to liberate Paris. The supreme commander of those forces, the American General Dwight Eisenhower, preferred to march straight to the German border on the Rhine, without detouring to defend the capital of France. It was the fierce insistence of General Charles de Gaulle that led to the change of plans. He and his right-hand man on Parisian soil, Jacques Chaban-Delmas, exposed the danger that the French forces of the interior, or FFI, commanded by a communist, would be the ones to liberate the city. This could not be allowed by the troops of the West, so the Allies became convinced that it was necessary to alter their route. De Gaulle also imposed that it was a French soldier who would enter Paris, supported by American troops. The chosen one was Philippe Leclerc, who took command of the 2nd Armored Division of the army. The revolution was about to begin, and Hitler's devastating request was gaining strength.
Ce type d'ordre se situe dans une logique qui est celle aussi de la fascination, de la fascination des nazis pour la destruction. Faire table rase, montrer qu'une fois qu'on partait, qu'une fois que l'Allemagne nazie partait, il ne restait plus rien.
The evidence that the Third Reich was on its way to its doom was becoming increasingly clear, and at that moment Paris was the best example of this. The streets seemed to be filled with gunpowder waiting for a small spark to explode. And when the time came, this was literally what the Führer was waiting for. Workers were on strike, there were supply problems, and resistance groups, especially communists, were setting up barricades and storming public buildings. Thanks to the mediation of the Swedish consul, Raoul Nordling, General von Choltitz agreed to a ceasefire in an attempt to keep the city under Nazi command. At that moment, he knew that Paris was lost. The arrival of the Allied troops seemed imminent, so he took advantage of the truce to organize the evacuation of his troops. However, before that, he had to fulfill the last mission entrusted by Hitler: destroy the city. Despite his growing doubts, the Nazi governor of the French capital went ahead with the next phase of the plan. He placed explosives in all the great Parisian symbols, in the Louvre Museum, on the Quai d'Orsay, in the Tuileries Garden, in the Opera Garnier, in the famous Notre Dame Cathedral, and of course in the Eiffel Tower. He did the same on all the vital bridges over the River Seine, such as the Pont des Almaz, close to the tunnel where Princess Diana would die in 1997, and even on the Pont des Invalides, very close to where Napoleon's remains are still preserved today. The German general had everything ready, and even left a message to the Führer to encourage the idea of destroying the city. "I will blow up the Eiffel Tower, and I will use its iron beams to obstruct access to the bridges that I will also blow up." Von Choltitz and his men created an enormous threat over Paris. Everything was ready to realize Hitler's sinister wishes, but in the decisive seconds, something changed radically.
It is said that as the Allies surrounded the French capital and his men awaited orders to once again raise a city before fleeing, von Choltitz felt overwhelmed with remorse and decided to disobey an order for the first time in his life, even if it came directly from Adolf Hitler.
The moment of truth had arrived. The German troops had given up on Paris and had begun to retreat. Meanwhile, the Nazi leader insistently asked if it was on fire, but no one had the answer he was hoping for. Von Choltitz disobeyed Hitler, and that fatal spark was never lit. At that very moment, several hypotheses arose about his decision. According to his own testimony, It was for logical, moral, and humanitarian reasons, but also because he considered that the Führer had gone completely mad. Another version claims that in a verbal duel against the clock with the consul Nordling, the Swedish diplomat managed to convince von Choltitz to disobey the order from Berlin to reduce the city to ashes. A third is that the German general did not blow up the French capital because he could not, as he lacked the necessary means to do so. In fact, this theory is supported by the idea that he did not hesitate to bomb Rotterdam or Sebastopol mercilessly. Finally, one last thing is that, once defeated, he preferred to surrender to the American troops and avoid reprisals from the resistance, or even avoid having to face a court for war crimes, becoming the savior of Paris. Von Choltitz made sure not to order any shootings or arrests in the last hours of the occupation. He also made sure to convince Hitler of the impossibility of carrying out his request due to a lack of material and personnel. The military man wanted to ensure that the Sippenhaft law, promoted by the Führer after suffering the attack, was not applied to him. According to this law, the penalties for a crime imputed to a Nazi officer were extensible to his entire family.
Throughout the decades, many experts disputed von Choltitz's role as the so-called savior of Paris, stating that the man merely clung to the idea in order to save face, as the Third Reich crumbled into pieces.
Von Choltitz n'avait pas comme principal but de sauver Paris, mais il avait comme principal but de sauver sa peau.
On August 25, 1944, Dietrich von Choltitz surrendered. He signed the terms of surrender drawn up by General Leclerc, leader of the Free French forces, and was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Normandy. From there, he was transferred to Trent Park Military Prison in London, where he remained for the rest of the war. This place was more than just a luxury prison for high-ranking officers. It was a trap created by British military intelligence to spy on German officers. The building was filled with listening devices. Among the surviving recordings are several of the men who disobeyed Adolf Hitler. In these, the general expresses his regret for having followed the Nazis, in particular, for the massacres of Jews on the Russian front. One of the quotes released refers to a talk in which von Choltitz said, "The worst task I ever carried out, although I carried it out with great efficiency, was the liquidation of the Jews. I carried out that order down to the smallest detail. I feel completely ashamed of myself." On the other hand, he also had words for the Führer, clearing up doubts about why he said no to his request.
And von Choltitz himself claimed to have saved the city till the day he passed. Quote, "If for this first time I disobeyed an order, it was because I knew Hitler was crazy."
No charges were ever brought against the man who had gone from being a loyal Axis general to the great savior of Allied France. At the end of the war, he was transferred to a prison center at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, United States. And in 1947, he was released to return to his family, who were in Baden-Baden. Dietrich von Choltitz died on 5 November 1966 from emphysema, having become one of the most controversial figures of World War II for being the one who defied Hitler's orders. The general was buried in his native Germany, and his funeral was attended by French officers as a way of honoring the savior of Paris. His story shows the differences within the German army. The troops were made up of men convinced to fight for the ideas of the Nazi Party, and others who simply fought for the flag of their country. This last group was the one that tried to quickly free itself from its past after the end of World War II. The time has come to say goodbye, but first we would like to know your opinion. Do you think that the act of saving Paris could compensate for all the horror caused by von Choltitz as a high-ranking Nazi? Leave us your comments. Now, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next installment of Military History.